In this video, I'll discuss the question of why stocks are so difficult to understand by shedding some light into the Gamestop scandal and the 2008 stock market crash. Do Wall Street bankers want to keep us all ignorant when it comes to finance? Who's to blame? And so much more. First, I'll give an introduction into the stock market and why it can be so difficult. The mechanism by which the stock market moves is simple. It's an auction. Every time you buy a stock, someone else must be willing to sell it before the transaction can be completed. Only if your two prices meet does the interaction occur. In practice, this means when a lot of people want to buy, the stock price is driven up, and when a lot want to sell, the stock price is driven down. I don't believe the stock market is all that hard to understand, but it's certainly terribly difficult to make money. The market is constantly being dragged up and down by buys and sells, each transmitting little information about what traders think what the true value is. But being right, fundamentally and theoretically, is not always going to save you in the market. The market is, at the very least, a second-order machine where being right means predicting what others will predict. Let's be honest, this stuff is pretty confusing, right? Does it make you feel bored or stupid? Well, it's supposed to. Wall Street loves to use confusing terms to make you think only they can do what they do, or even better, for you to just leave them the F alone. Ask yourself this: who benefits from the confusion? If clarity and mutually beneficial ideas are the goal, then why the redundancy, specifically altered vocabulary, and disproportionate bias that averts consumer protection? Not convinced? Let's look at some statistics. 1 in 4 people have committed to a financial agreement without fully understanding it. More than half of the adults they surveyed said they believed they had overpaid for something because the language in the contract was unnecessarily complicated. While Americans self-report they have financial knowledge, a basic literacy quiz shows otherwise. According to a national survey of financial capability in the United States in 2009, young adults scored the worst. The same survey reveals that just over 50% of Americans report that they have no rainy day fund to sustain them for 3 to 6 months in case of sickness, job loss, or other emergencies. And if the language being used to define these concepts makes it harder for people to make such substantial savings, then that risks leaving them trapped within uncompetitive products paying inflated prices. By now you've probably heard about the controversy surrounding Gamestop and other stocks and their effects on the stock market, but you may not totally understand what's going on. To explain, stocks like GameStop, AMC, BlackBerry, Bed Bath & Beyond, and others have generally been ignored as they were struggling stocks. These stocks caught the attention of short-term traders online, specifically the Reddit board /Wall Street Bets. The value of these stocks has skyrocketed since they caught the internet's attention. Most people buy stocks in the sense that they're going to go long, which means I buy a stock and I hope it appreciates over time. There are some investors that will short a stock. So instead of holding that stock, they are going out, borrowing the shares from someone else, and then selling them with the hope that the price will drop and they can buy back at a lower price. Essentially, most investors hold a stock and want the price to go up. Short sellers sell quickly and want the price to drop. While anyone can technically short a stock, it's usually professional investors that do so, such as hedge funds. But now, part-time investors on sites like Reddit are rallying around stocks and buying an extreme amount of the stock. This is causing conflicting parties. Short sellers want the price to drop. The Redditors want the price to rise. And because of all this buying activity, this causes the price to rise, forcing short sellers to cut their losses, which allows other investors to turn around and buy their stocks Further amplifying the buying activity, Wall Street Bet's fascination with GameStop started in early 2020 when they noticed that a share of GameStop cost around $4. At the time of making this video, the GameStop share is around $220. That's a 5,400% increase. Even with all this explained, the language used by internet traders is still confusing to most. Now, what most people don't know is that something much similar to this happened all the way back in 2008, the infamous 2008 stock market crash. Fortunately, there's a movie explaining all of this called The Big Short. In the movie, there's a scene where Margot Robbie is for some reason in a bathtub describing mortgage bonds and how to short them. Considering that the entire GameStop fiasco revolves around stock traders on Reddit trying to stick it to the hedge funds shorting the video game retailer, the implied analogy between this recent scandal and the movie, which was also based on real life, could not have been more appropriate. This movie shows a group of people that bet that the US housing market would crash, using a process known as shorting. By doing this, these investors can make money out of products losing value, and successes can be made from the failure of others. Most of us, when buying a house, will take out a mortgage and pay back the purchase price over time. We also usually hope that the value of the house we buy will go up and not down. In the US, many people had come to assume that house prices would always rise because they'd always risen without fail for many years. This attitude saw mortgage lenders offering riskier and riskier loans to people who would only be able to make payments if the price of their house continued to increase.
My firm offers ninja loans. No income, no job. I just leave the income section blank if I want. Corporate doesn't care. These people just want homes.
These mortgage loans were sold and traded between financial institutions. A bank doesn't mind taking on the debt if they know that it will get paid back regularly over the term of the loan. And of course, they'll make some money from the interest. But the kind of risky mortgages being arranged in the US seemed like unattractive investments. So instead of selling individual loans, banks would group mortgages of all different risk levels together and sell them in slices as a new product called a collateralized debt obligation.
Collateralized debt obligation. It's important to understand because it's what allowed a housing crisis to become a nationwide economic disaster.
These products were so complex that it was difficult to know how risky they were, but because the US housing market was always a safe bet, their use grew and grew until the CDO market was worth $226 billion in 2006. It was around this point that hedge fund manager Michael Burry realized that the housing market was overvalued, with much of it based on risky mortgages. If you can predict a risky product with fail, then you can make big profits from that prediction. So, how does that work? It's a bit like an insurance contract. Another party agrees to pay out if something bad happens and your product loses its value. And why do they agree to this? Because you pay them. Michael Burry convinced various big banks to shoulder the burden of his products based on risky housing mortgages and paid them big fees every month to do so. They were happy to take on the risk because they too were sure house prices would keep going up. This arrangement was called a credit default swap, or CDS. Several others agreed with Burry that the market would crash and made similar investment choices that at the time seemed insane to everyone else. Burry's clients begged him to change course. On the surface, the housing market was surging, and every day that went by without a crash was costing Burry and his investors millions in premiums to the banks that had agreed to the CDS arrangements. But at the end, Burry was right, and when the mortgage bubble finally burst and people couldn't pay their debts, the banks were forced to pay Burry as per the contracts they signed, making massive profits for his investment fund. What Burry may not have foreseen was how catastrophic the collapse of the housing market would be for the global economy. In fact, we're still feeling the effects today. Their gains were a consequence of thousands of American families failing to pay back their mortgages and losing their homes. This film is a great piece of entertainment, while making the high-stakes, jargon-heavy world of finance much more accessible. Although it's funny and will keep you interested throughout, more importantly, it sheds light on economic events that still resonate today. The CDO market was barely regulated, and politicians have been trying to rectify this culture ever since. In the aftermath of this crash, the requirements to secure a mortgage were toughened up considerably, although many worry that lenders are returning to the risky loans that preceded the crash last time. Michael Burry and others may have made billions from The Big Short, but everyone else lost, and taxpayers are still paying the price today. These two incidents are examples of how individuals hack the system for their own profit. Never in financial history has there been a bigger transfer of wealth between the rich to the poor. But still, unfortunately, the public still remains somewhat ignorant, and this continued lack of knowledge considering finance by the general American public is dangerous and even outrageous. The fact is that people are repeatedly encouraged to spend all the money they have, plus borrow more to spend what they don't have. Not only this, but our economy relies on people over borrowing to drive demand, because workers are usually underpaid. Thus, the wages of workers cannot possibly support the production of the economy. Workers are encouraged to overborrow because this drives the profits of the capitalist. Profits are driven by underpaying workers and getting them to borrow money to overpay for the commodities that they produce, thus widening the gap between the cost of production and the revenue from sales. The American public is simply doing exactly what the economic system has been designed to encourage them to do. And as long as this phenomenon of financial illiteracy continues, more incidents will happen, such as the 2008 crash, and the general public will continue to be oblivious about it. So, read, learn, and grow. The financial world is the Shark Tank. So, how will you survive?